Hey everyone. If you're looking for a story that makes you question the true cost of perfection and the unexpected paths to love, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments below where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always exciting to see who's joining us from around the world. The Billionaire's Contract Bride. $10 million, 2 years of marriage, and a mandatory medical exam to confirm her virginity. Julian Vance's voice resonated with calculated coldness. His penetrating gaze, colder than the marble walls of his office, fixed on the director of the relations agency, who seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. "Mr. Vance, your request is peculiar, but not unusual in our line of work," the man replied, nervously adjusting his tie. "We guarantee absolute discretion and fulfillment of your demands." "I expect so. I'm not interested in surprises or mistakes. The medical tests are non-negotiable." Julian leaned back in the wide black leather armchair, crossing his legs with the same controlled elegance that characterized him. The director nodded, discreetly wiping his forehead with a handkerchief, trying to hide the sweat caused by the tension of the moment. "The candidates will be informed of all conditions before proceeding," he added carefully. "Your confidentiality is guaranteed." "Confidentiality and efficiency. That's what I'm paying for," Julian interrupted, his tone sharp, cutting off any attempt at objection. The director slightly inclined his head in a mix of respect and relief before leaving the room. The door closed with an almost imperceptible click, leaving Julian alone in his imposing office. The silence that followed was punctuated only by the soft ticking of a wall clock. Julian stood, walking towards the window that offered a panoramic view of Silverwood City. The lights of the skyscrapers illuminated the horizon, but he didn't see the landscape. His mind was elsewhere, reviewing the clauses of the contract he had drafted with surgical precision. A marriage for 2 years, without emotional ties or obligations beyond those strictly stipulated. The ideal candidate had to accept his terms without questioning them and meet the most controversial requirement, virginity, confirmed by a medical examination. "It's necessary," he told himself, justifying the clause. After all, this was not a traditional marriage. It was a transaction, designed to fulfill his grandmother's last wish, without involving unnecessary complications. However, as he poured a glass of whiskey, a slight discomfort invaded him. It wasn't his fault that emotions were inconvenient. He had learned from a young age that trusting someone was a risk not worth taking. That's why he had structured his life as he did now, with logic, control, and distance. He took a sip of his drink, letting the warmth of the liquor clear his mind. Deep down, however, a persistent voice questioned him. Why did the idea of that examination, so essential according to his logic, make him feel vulnerable? He shook his head, pushing the thought away as if it were a fleeting annoyance. He had no time for emotional questions. This agreement was the best for him, clear, direct, and with no margin for error. Back at his desk, he picked up the contract papers and reviewed each clause. Once more, the words were precise, calculated to protect him from any inconvenience. And yet, an echo of doubt remained in the back of his mind, difficult to ignore. The sound of the intercom broke the silence. "Mr. Vance, the agency team has begun the selection process. They will report back as soon as they have results." Julian pressed the button to turn off the device and set the papers aside. He walked to the window once more, this time with the glass of whiskey in his hand, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. He had designed this contract to avoid surprises, but an unexpected thought crossed his mind. What if the woman who accepted this agreement ended up being a complication instead of a solution? He clenched his jaw, dismissing the idea firmly. This was nothing more than a business deal, a necessary formality. His life was perfectly controlled, and no one, much less a stranger, would alter that. He took another sip of whiskey and took a deep breath. It was time to close this chapter and await the results. The sound of paper unfolding resonated in Eleanor Reed's small kitchen. Sitting at her worn table, a cup of cold coffee in her hands, her eyes scanned every word of the advertisement she had found in a local newspaper. The promise of $10 million seemed unreal, almost absurd. However, the seriousness of the conditions made everything seem too authentic to ignore. From the half-open door, she could hear the muffled laughter of her two younger siblings, Thomas and Lily, playing in the backyard. They knew nothing of the bank notices, of the deadlines that had already expired, or of the sleepless nights Eleanor spent trying to find a solution. Her mother's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Looking at those papers again? You'll ruin your eyesight." Eleanor quickly put the ad away, sliding it under a pile of unpaid bills. "I'm just organizing things," she said. But inside, the battle was evident. Pride against desperation. Every fiber of her being rejected the idea of submitting to such a cold and impersonal agreement. Who in their right mind would accept something like that? And yet, the numbers were clear. Her family's debt wouldn't disappear with good intentions. That night, while the rest of the house slept, Eleanor took out the ad again. Her fingers traced the printed letters, as if searching for some sign, something that would confirm she wasn't making a mistake. Her reflection in the window pane looked back at her. Someone trapped between duty and fear. The next day, heart pounding, she dialed the number at the end of the ad. "Vance Agency, how can I help you?" A professional voice responded on the other end of the line. Eleanor took a breath, feeling every word weigh tons. "I'm calling about the advertisement. I'm interested in the proposal." A brief but thick silence preceded the response. "Perfect. We will send you the details of the selection process." When she hung up, the reality of her decision hit her like a wave. She had taken the first step towards something that could save her family, or change her life forever. What do you think is the biggest hurdle for Eleanor in accepting this unusual marriage contract? Will Julian's cold demeanor make it impossible for them to find any common ground? Share your predictions below. A fateful meeting, the sound of Eleanor's heels resonated softly against the marble floor as she entered the meeting room. Her eyes swept the space, pausing at the large windows that offered an impressive view of Silverwood City, before meeting the figure of Julian Vance. He stood, impeccably poised, with a gaze that seemed to pierce through her. "Miss Reed, welcome," he said, extending a firm hand. Eleanor accepted the gesture, feeling an unexpected spark as their skin touched. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. "Thank you for seeing me." Her voice was more confident than she felt. Julian gestured to a chair across from the desk. When they both sat down, he pushed a folder towards her. Every movement was precise, almost mechanical, yet Eleanor couldn't help but notice how his eyes lingered on her for longer than necessary. "This is the contract. It details the previously discussed conditions, including the mandatory medical exam." Eleanor's gaze slid to the documents. The words, clear and direct, seemed heavier with each line she read. Her breathing slowed, as if she were trying to process the weight of the decision. "I want you to know that all of this is handled with the utmost confidentiality," Julian added, his tone firm, yet inexplicably calm. She nodded, taking the pen he offered. Their fingers brushed for an instant, and a shiver ran through her body. Julian didn't look away, but something in his eyes seemed to soften for a moment. With a deep sigh, Eleanor signed. Julian picked up the documents and put them in a folder with precise movements. Then he leaned back slightly in his chair, observing her with a mix of curiosity and approval. "Welcome to the agreement, Miss Reed." Eleanor looked up, feeling as if she had just crossed a threshold into the unknown. The wrought iron gate slowly opened, revealing the imposing Vance Manor. Eleanor watched from inside the car, feeling small before the marble columns and perfectly manicured gardens that stretched out like a tapestry of perfection. The driver stopped the vehicle in front of the main entrance, where two employees waited in silence. Eleanor stepped out of the car, clutching the handle of her suitcase tightly. Her footsteps echoed on the stone steps as her gaze tried to take in the luxury surrounding her, a mix of awe and nervousness reflected on her face. "Miss Reed," Julian's voice broke the silence. He appeared at the entrance, impeccable as always, his dark suit contrasting with the gleaming white of the walls behind him. His eyes, though impenetrable, seemed to study her more closely than she could bear. "Welcome. I hope your journey was comfortable." Eleanor nodded, trying to ignore the weight of his gaze. "Yes, thank you." Julian gestured towards the door, inviting her in. She followed him, feeling increasingly aware of every step she took. The interior of the mansion was even more impressive. Marble floors, glittering chandeliers on the ceiling, and art that seemed to belong in a museum. "This will be your home for the next 2 years," Julian commented as they walked through the spacious foyer. "If you need anything, the staff will be at your disposal." Although his words were courteous, his tone remained distant, almost mechanical. Eleanor noticed how he maintained a certain physical distance, as if he were marking an invisible boundary. Upon reaching the main living room, Julian stopped and looked at her. "They will show you your room. Take your time to settle in." Eleanor nodded, silently grateful for the space to catch her breath. But as he walked away, she couldn't help but notice the brief pause in his stride, as if there was something he wanted to say, but couldn't. Standing in the middle of that majestic mansion, Eleanor felt she had just entered a world beyond her. And yet, a small voice inside her whispered that she shouldn't back down. How do you think Eleanor will adapt to living in Julian's luxurious yet cold world? Will the strict terms of their contract allow for any genuine connection to form between them? Share your insights below. A cold grandeur. The sound of the grandfather clock filled the silence of the dining room. Eleanor sat before a sprawling banquet she had barely touched, the chandeliers illuminating the space with a warmth that contrasted with the cold air around her. Opposite her, Julian read documents with impenetrable concentration, his presence as imposing as the mansion itself. Eleanor looked towards the tall windows, where the rain was beginning to fall in a soft murmur. She felt a constant weight in her chest, a mix of loneliness and the pressure of a setting that felt alien to her. She had spent 3 days exploring the endless hallways, finding more questions than answers about how to fit into that place. "Is something not to your liking?" Julian asked, without looking up from his papers, his voice so quiet it almost blended with the sound of the rain. Eleanor took a second to respond, surprised by the interruption. "Everything is fine. I'm just not used to this." Julian looked up, his gray eyes studying her intently. He said nothing, but his expression showed a hint of curiosity. Later, as she walked through the garden under an umbrella, Eleanor stopped in front of a statue depicting a woman with a serene expression. Water collected at the edges of the marble, and the cold air raised goosebumps on her skin. Despite the luxury, she couldn't ignore how empty that house seemed. From a window on the upper floor, Julian watched her in silence. There was something in the way she held the umbrella, facing the rain, instead of taking shelter inside, that intrigued him. He had known many people who tried to fit into his world, but Eleanor didn't seem interested in that. Her presence, though discreet, carried a weight he didn't expect. That night, as Eleanor wrote a letter to her family, she felt a small spark of determination. If she was going to be there, She would do everything possible to maintain her essence intact, even in the midst of a world that tried to devour her. Julian, from his study, found himself thinking about her more than he would have liked to admit. The clock read 11 p.m. when Eleanor, wrapped in a silk robe that didn't feel like hers, came out of the bathroom. Her steps were slow, as if each one brought her closer to the unknown. As she crossed the doorway, she saw Julian sitting in an armchair by the window, a glass of wine in his hand. The dim light of the room highlighted his features, and his expression was calm, almost distant. "Are you comfortable?" he asked, looking up. Eleanor nodded, but her breathing betrayed the nerves she tried to hide. "Yes, thank you." Julian put the glass on the table and stood up, walking calmly towards her. His height and the confidence in his movements filled the space, but there was a softness in his gaze that surprised her. "You don't have to feel obligated to anything." His voice was lower than usual. Eleanor looked at him, confused by the mix of authority and consideration he exuded. Her hands fiddled with the belt of her robe, a gesture he noticed but didn't mention. "I know," she finally replied, almost in a whisper. Julian took a step closer, reducing the distance between them. The room was silent, but the tension was palpable. When he raised a hand towards her, he did so slowly, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. His fingers brushed Eleanor's cheek, a gesture as unexpected as it was delicate. "I want tonight to be something you remember calmly, not with fear," he said. Those words made Eleanor breathe more deeply. Her eyes sought Julian's, and in that moment, something changed. The nervousness began to transform into a warmth she hadn't anticipated. He took a step back, offering her space to decide. Eleanor, after an instant of doubt, moved closer to him. It was she who placed a hand on his chest, feeling the steady beats beneath the fabric. Julian watched her in silence, letting her set the pace. The rest of the night was a delicate balance between the intensity of the chemistry they shared and the tenderness Julian showed in every gesture. Eleanor discovered a facet of him she didn't expect, and Julian, deep down, realized that this connection went beyond the physical. When they finally fell silent, with moonlight filtering through the curtains, Eleanor closed her eyes with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Julian watched her sleep, aware that something profound had changed between them. "What do you think will be the next step in Julian and Eleanor's evolving relationship? Will they break the terms of their contract, or will they find a way to honor it while exploring their feelings? Share your predictions below." Beyond the contract, the sound of coffee pouring into the cup broke the comfortable silence that filled the spacious kitchen. Eleanor sat by the counter, observing Julian's calculated movements. It was strange to see him there, in such an everyday act, far from the rigidity that constantly enveloped him. "I didn't think you knew how to make coffee," she commented with a faint smile, trying to soften the atmosphere. Julian looked up for an instant as he pushed the cup towards her. "Not everything requires help. Some things are better done yourself." She took the cup, feeling the warmth in her hands, and sipped, enjoying the intense flavor that filled her palate. "It's good. Perhaps you have a hidden talent for this." "I don't think opening a cafe is in my plans," he replied with a soft laugh, a sound that resonated in the space, unexpected but pleasant. The moment unfolded unhurriedly. Julian leaned on the counter, crossing his arms, his gaze lingering on Eleanor for longer than he intended, as if trying to understand what made her so different from everything he had known. Later, as they walked through the garden, the afternoon light tinged the flowers with a warm golden hue. Julian pointed to a group of perfectly tended rose bushes. "My grandmother planted these. She always said the most beautiful flowers are those that survive storms." Eleanor leaned in to observe them closely, letting the sweet aroma envelop her. So these roses have a story. They're precious. Julian looked at her in silence, noticing how the light highlighted the serenity of her face. There was something in her way of appreciating small things that disconcerted him. She used to sit here with me, talking about what really matters in life. His tone, almost a whisper, revealed a deep connection to those memories. That night, the conversation continued during dinner. Eleanor spoke of her childhood, her mother's sacrifices, and the dreams she still held. Julian, in turn, shared anecdotes he had never told before, stories of a youth he barely remembered. As night fell, they found themselves in the living room, each with a glass of wine in hand. Neither spoke, but there was no need. The silence was filled with a warmth that went beyond words. Julian looked at her from across the sofa, and for the first time in years, he felt something in his rigid and controlled world begin to soften. The sun began to set behind the hills, painting the sky with warm shades of orange and pink. Julian walked slowly along a garden path, hands in his pockets and a thoughtful expression. By his side, Eleanor followed in silence, letting the tranquility of the moment fill the air between them. "This place is breathtaking," she finally said, breaking the silence as she looked at the flowers swaying gently in the breeze. Julian nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "My grandmother spent hours here. She said the garden was her refuge, her way of reminding us that even the most delicate things can flourish amidst chaos." Eleanor observed him, intrigued by the softness of his voice. There was something in his words, a nostalgia she hadn't heard before. "It seems she was very important to you," she commented cautiously, not wanting to invade his space. Julian stopped and turned to her for the first time. His gaze wasn't impenetrable. There was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes that left her breathless. "She was. My grandmother was the only person who always believed in me, even when I didn't." His words came out slower, as if each carried an emotional weight. Isabel took a step towards him, feeling the need to close the distance that separated them. "Sometimes allowing ourselves to be vulnerable doesn't make us weak, but more human," she said softly. Julian looked at her as if her words had touched something deep within him. Before he realized it, he leaned slightly towards her. Eleanor didn't back away. Instead, her eyes closed as their lips met in a slow, genuine kiss that seemed to erase all the barriers separating them. When they separated, neither spoke a word, but something had changed. The air between them was charged with something new, something neither could ignore. Julian offered her a faint smile, the first Eleanor had truly seen. "Perhaps you're right," she smiled back, feeling that, for the first time, both were beginning to understand each other. How will the truth about Eleanor's family and her financial struggles impact Julian's perception of her? Will he be able to set aside his pride and truly support her? Share your predictions below. Julian was reviewing a report in his office when an unexpected document caught his attention. Among the meticulously organized papers, he found a note accompanied by financial records. He immediately recognized the names. They belonged to Eleanor's family. His curiosity led him to examine the figures, which painted a clear picture of the debts they faced and the sacrifices she had made to keep them afloat. He leaned back in his chair, intertwining his fingers as he processed the information. For the first time, he understood the magnitude of Eleanor's commitment. She had not accepted the agreement out of ambition or personal interest, but out of desperation and an unbreakable will to protect her family. That discovery, far from generating doubt, awakened in him a deep admiration. Later that afternoon, Julian decided to look for her. He found her in the greenhouse, a space she seemed to have adopted as her own. She was leaning over a plant, carefully cleaning the damp leaves. Her concentration was mesmerizing, and for a moment, he simply watched her from the entrance, trying to understand how someone so different from him had begun to occupy his mind. "It seems this place has become your refuge," he finally commented, breaking the silence. Eleanor looked up, surprised, but soon offered a faint smile. "It's peaceful. Here I can think and set aside the noise of everything else." Julian took a step towards her, taking a leaf between his fingers and examining it intently. "I didn't know you had so much patience for these things." "Perhaps it's not patience," she replied, setting down the tool she was holding. "Sometimes caring for something helps you find peace." He held her gaze, her words resonating more deeply than he expected. "I think I'm starting to understand." "Understand what?" she asked, her curiosity evident. Julian took a moment before responding. "What it means to put others before yourself." A faint blush colored Eleanor's cheeks, but she didn't look away. "I think when you love someone, it's not a choice. You just do it." Julian nodded slowly, impressed by her strength and sincerity. That night, as he reviewed documents in his study, his thoughts incessantly returned to Eleanor. For the first time, he allowed himself to admit something that had been unsettling him. She was not just a partner in this contract. She was much more, and he could not ignore it. The greenhouse still smelled of wet earth and fresh flowers, but for Julian, that space now held a completely new meaning. The echo of Eleanor's footsteps resonated through the silent hallways of the mansion. She had spent the day trying to concentrate on her daily tasks, but her mind couldn't help but return to every glance, every word, and every gesture she had shared with Julian in recent weeks. Something inside her stirred, an uncomfortable mix of uncertainty and longing she couldn't decipher. She found him in the main living room, standing by one of the windows, a glass in his hand, and his gaze lost on the horizon. The dim light of the lamps cast soft shadows on his face, giving him a more vulnerable air than he probably intended to show. "Are you okay?" she asked, breaking the silence. Julian turned his head slightly, surprised by her presence. He took a moment before responding, thinking, "Sometimes numbers don't solve everything." Isabel frowned, intrigued. "I didn't know you tried anything other than numbers." He let out a brief but not entirely cheerful laugh. "Some things can't be calculated." She advanced a couple of steps, feeling the physical distance as a reflection of the emotional one that always seemed to be between them. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why are you hiding behind that distance?" Julian turned completely towards her, his gray eyes shining with an intensity that made her stop. "It's not that simple, Eleanor. Nothing is. But that doesn't mean it's not worth trying," she retorted, with unexpected firmness. He clenched his jaw, as if fighting something that had been buried for too long. "I'm not used to letting others in." Eleanor took another step, closing the distance between them. "Perhaps you don't have to get used to it. Perhaps you just need to try." The silence that followed was charged with something indescribable. Both looked at each other as if seeking answers they couldn't find for themselves. Finally, Julian looked away and placed the glass on a nearby table. "I don't know if I can give you what you deserve, Eleanor." She took a deep breath, sensing the truth in his words, but also the fear that held him back. "I'm not asking for perfection, only honesty." Julian looked at her once more, his eyes filled with an internal struggle that seemed impossible to resolve at that moment. But something in his expression suggested he was beginning to consider what Eleanor had just said. The air between them remained tense, but this time it seemed to be filled with possibilities. The fireplace crackled softly, filling the living room with a warmth that contrasted with the cold night outside. Eleanor was sitting on the sofa, legs crossed, a book in her hands, though her eyes weren't moving across the pages. Her mind was occupied with Julian's words the last time they spoke, with that internal struggle he seemed unable to overcome. The sound of firm footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Looking up, she saw Julian entering the room, his expression laden with something she couldn't identify. Without saying anything, he sat across from her in the armchair by the fire. "There's something I think you should know," he finally said, breaking the silence. Eleanor put the book aside, leaning slightly towards him. His voice had a different nuance, as if each word was being extracted with effort. "You can tell me anything you want," she responded softly. Julian fixed his gaze on the flames, as if seeking the courage he needed there. "My childhood wasn't like the stories I usually tell. My mother died when I was a child, and my father—" He paused, clenching his fists on his knees. "My father was a harsh man, incapable of showing affection." Isabel watched him, noticing how his shoulders tensed as he spoke. She didn't interrupt him, allowing him to continue at his own pace. "I grew up believing that vulnerability was a flaw, something that could be exploited. Every time I showed emotions, my father made me pay for it." His voice broke slightly, but he continued. "I learned to build barriers, to keep everyone at a distance." The silence that followed was heavy, but Eleanor broke it by getting up and sitting beside him. Gently, she placed a hand on his, which was still clenched in a fist. "You don't have to carry that alone, Julian. Not with me." He looked at her, his eyes reflecting a mix of surprise and relief. It was as if her words had touched a place no one had reached before. For the first time, Julian allowed his hand to relax under Eleanor's. "I don't know how to leave these barriers behind, but I want to try." Isabel smiled softly, squeezing his hand. "That's the first step." In that moment, the fire in the fireplace seemed to glow a little brighter, as if reflecting the warmth that now filled the room. "What do you think will be the next step for Julian and Eleanor after this heartfelt confession? How will their growing emotional bond impact their professional relationship and the terms of their contract? Share your predictions below. A leap of faith, a shared future. The atmosphere in Julian's office was tense, charged with uncertainty. The numbers on the computer screen were clear. A rival acquisition threatened to destabilize his company. His hands rested on the desk, but his mind raced. The sound of light footsteps pulled him from his concentration. Eleanor appeared at the door, her brow slightly furrowed. She had learned to recognize that gesture in him, a mix of frustration and calculation that revealed more than he intended. "Is everything all right?" she asked cautiously, approaching. Julian let out a sigh, leaning back in his chair. "Not exactly. It seems a rival is trying to take advantage of a moment of weakness." Eleanor remained silent for a moment, assessing the situation. Finally, she sat across from him, resting her hands on the table. "Let me see the details." Julian raised an eyebrow, surprised by her decisive tone, but turned the monitor towards her. As Eleanor read the documents, her gaze filled with concentration, and Julian couldn't help but feel a mix of curiosity and admiration. "Here's the problem," she finally said, pointing to a line in the report. "They're betting you won't respond quickly. If you make a public move that disproves this perception, you could disarm their strategy." "A public move?" Julian repeated, crossing his arms. "Yes. An official statement, backed by a concrete action, like an event or a strategic partnership. Something that shows your company isn't weakened, but in control." Julian looked at her with an intensity that made her hesitate for an instant. "It's risky," Eleanor felt. "I know," he said, "but sometimes to win, you have to take risks." The idea was quickly implemented. Eleanor, alongside Julian, attended a gala event where they announced a key collaboration with another company. Her quiet but determined presence caught everyone's attention. When she spoke on behalf of the company, her words were firm and precise, dispelling any rumors of instability. That night, back home, Julian couldn't take his eyes off her. Her strength and clarity had saved the day, but what impacted him most was the way she was willing to support him without hesitation. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said softly, looking directly into her eyes. She smiled. "You don't have to thank me. We're a team, remember?" For the first time, those words resonated deeply within him. The rain lashed heavily against the mansion windows, filling the air with a constant sound that accompanied the silence in the dining room. Eleanor was sitting at the end of the table, pushing the remains of her dinner with her fork, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions: frustration, sadness, exhaustion. Opposite her, Julian reviewed a report, seemingly immune to the tension floating in the air. Finally, Eleanor put her fork down on the plate with a dry sound that echoed more than expected. "I can't go on like this, Julian." He looked up, his brows furrowed in surprise. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean," she replied, her voice firm, though her hands trembled in her lap. "This marriage, this agreement, cannot continue to be a facade." Julian put the report down on the table and leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her. "We've met the conditions of the contract, Eleanor. I don't understand what else you expect from me." "It's not about the contract," she exclaimed, standing. Her voice cut through the air, overshadowing even the sound of the rain. "It's about us, about what I feel, and about what you're clearly afraid to admit." Julian remained silent, his hands pressed against the arms of the chair. The coldness that had always been his shield now seemed to falter, but it still didn't completely break. "You can't keep hiding behind those barriers, not with me," Eleanor continued, her voice breaking slightly. "I've shown you who I am. I've given you everything I could. But if you're not willing to do the same, then I can't stay." Julian slowly rose, his movements laden with visible tension. "Eleanor, it's not that simple for me." "And you think it has been for me?" she retorted, her eyes filled with frustration and pain. She took a step towards him, as if trying to break the invisible distance that separated them. "I've been fighting for us since the beginning, but I can't do it alone." The silence that followed was heavy, like a rope pulled taut to its limit. Finally, Eleanor shook her head and turned away, walking towards the exit. Her footsteps echoed on the marble, firm but laden with sadness. "Eleanor, wait," Julian said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but she didn't stop. She paused by the door without turning. "When you're ready to be honest with yourself, you'll know where to find me." That night, as the rain continued its incessant rhythm, Julian remained alone in the dining room, facing a void he had never before felt so deeply. The cold night breeze caressed Eleanor's face as she sat on the porch of her small family home. She had returned there, seeking refuge, a place where she could collect her thoughts, far from the imposing mansion and the complexity of Julian. However, even in that quiet corner, her mind kept returning to him. A sound of footsteps broke the silence. Looking up, she saw Julian's figure approaching slowly. His usual imposing demeanor now seemed more human, vulnerable. "Eleanor," he said, his voice hoarse but determined. She looked at him, her expression neutral, though her heart pounded. She hadn't expected to see him there, but she also couldn't deny that a part of her had wished for it. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone trying to be colder than it really was. Julian took a deep breath, as if he needed to gather all his courage before speaking. "I've been a coward." The words took her by surprise, and he continued before she could reply. "I've hidden behind my fears and my barriers for so long that I forgot what it means to open up, to trust someone. But you have shown me what it means to have something real, something worthwhile. Eleanor looked away, feeling her emotions mix in a whirlwind. It's not enough to say it, Julian. Words change nothing if you're not willing to prove it. He took another step towards her, closing the distance. I know, and I don't expect you to trust me immediately, but I want you to know that I'm willing to try, to be the man you deserve. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, though she held her head high. Because now, Julian knelt before her, something he never would have imagined doing, because I can't imagine my life without you. I don't want to go back to that void. The silence between them was charged, but this time it was filled with possibilities. Eleanor finally let out a long sigh. I'll give you a chance, Julian, but this time, don't fail me. He nodded, and without waiting any longer, he leaned in towards her, his lips finding Eleanor's in a kiss that sealed the promise of a new beginning. What do you think will be the next chapter for Julian and Eleanor after this heartfelt reconciliation? Will their love story finally have its happy ending? Share your predictions below. A future, written together. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen, as Eleanor, one hand resting on the counter, held a small white envelope. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, and her eyes scanned the printed words again and again. She took a deep breath, trying to process what she had just read, but her heart was pounding so fast it was hard to think clearly. A sound of footsteps behind her startled her from her reverie. She quickly turned her head, hiding the envelope by instinct, and saw Julian enter the room. His hair was slightly disheveled, and his expression, though relaxed, transformed as he noticed the tension on Eleanor's face. "What are you doing up so early?" he asked, approaching the coffee maker and pouring himself a cup of coffee. She hesitated for a moment, clutching the envelope to her chest. "Julian, I need to tell you something." He put the cup on the table and turned to her, frowning. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to control the trembling in her hands. As she extended the envelope towards him, Julian took it carefully, breaking the seal, and reading the words in silence. His eyes widened in surprise, and his jaw tightened slightly before he looked up at her. "It's true?" His voice was barely a whisper, filled with emotion. She nodded with a mix of fear and joy reflected on her face. "I'm going to have a baby." Julian stood motionless for what seemed like an eternity. His eyes were fixed on Eleanor's, but his mind seemed to be processing the magnitude of what he had just heard. Finally, he took a step towards her and took her hands with a delicacy he had rarely shown. "This changes everything." His voice was firm, without a trace of doubt. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, and a sob escaped her lips. "Are you sure? I don't want this to be a burden for you." Julian shook his head quickly. "Eleanor, you've already changed my life in ways I never imagined. This isn't a burden. It's a gift. Something I didn't know I wanted until now." He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close to his chest as she cried softly. In that embrace, Eleanor felt something she had never felt before: complete security, an implicit promise that she would never be alone. Later, as they walked through the gardens, Julian spoke with a sincerity she hadn't expected. "I promise I'll do everything I can to be the man you and our child need. I don't want to make the mistakes of the past." Eleanor stopped and looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of love and hope. "I trust you, Julian, but I also know you don't have to make everything perfect. I just want us to do it together." The rest of the day was filled with conversations about the future, about names for the baby, about how they wanted to build a different life, full of love and commitment. The warmth of those moments seemed to envelop them, making both their fears dissipate little by little. That night, as they watched the starry sky from the terrace, Eleanor took Julian's hand and gently placed it on her belly. "This is where it all begins," she whispered, with a calm smile that reflected the peace she now felt. Julian squeezed her hand gently, looking into her eyes with a mix of emotion and determination. "And I'm going to make sure it's a beginning worthy of you and our child." The night breeze played with the loose strands of Eleanor's hair as they both stood there, under an infinite sky, dreaming together of the life that awaited them. Both knew that the path would not be without challenges, but they also understood that together they could face anything. The sound of the laughter they shared that night, the warmth of the love that enveloped them, and the promise of a bright future would become memories they would cherish forever. They had found something beyond words, something that would give them the strength to build a meaningful life. The morning light softly filtered through the linen curtains of their new country house, where Julian and Eleanor had decided to start fresh. Unlike the imposing mansion, this house had a distinct warmth, every corner reflecting the shared choices of their marriage, from the flowers in the garden, planted by Eleanor's own hands, to the small room already decorated for their future child. Eleanor was sitting on the porch, looking at the horizon. In her hands, she held a newly written letter addressed to her mother and siblings. Since her marriage to Julian, she had made sure her financial problems were a thing of the past. But more importantly, she had kept her connection with them alive. The letter was a reminder that her love for them remained intact, even in her new life. Julian came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee, his stride calm, a reflection of the transformation he had undergone. As he handed one of the cups to Eleanor, he sat beside her, enjoying the moment without the need for words. "I've been thinking," he finally said, breaking the silence. "Perhaps it's time to take a step back from the company." Eleanor looked at him in surprise. "Are you sure?" Julian nodded, looking at the horizon. "For years I thought my worth depended on how much I could control, on how much I could build. But now I understand that the most valuable thing I have is right here." He turned to her, his gaze sincere and calm. "And I want to be present for you and for our child." Eleanor smiled, though a small concern creased her brow. "And what about your responsibilities? I know how much they mean to you." Julian took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I've been training a trusted team. They can handle the day-to-day. I'm not abandoning what I built, but I want to find a balance." As they spoke, the sound of an approaching car interrupted their conversation. Eleanor stood up, seeing her mother and siblings get out, laden with bags and smiles. The hugs were warm, and laughter filled the air as everyone gathered in the garden. "This place is beautiful," Eleanor's mother commented, observing the landscape. "It's our home now," Eleanor replied with a gleam of pride in her eyes. Julian joined the group, carrying a tray of refreshments. Although he still maintained his serious demeanor, there was a softness in his behavior that pleasantly surprised them. As the afternoon progressed, Eleanor's siblings began to explore the surroundings, while her mother helped Eleanor in the kitchen. That night, with the family gathered around an outdoor table, Julian raised his glass. "I want to thank you for being here, and for allowing us to share this new chapter with you." Everyone toasted, and the atmosphere filled with a warmth that only family closeness could provide. Later, when the house was silent and everyone had retired to rest, Eleanor and Julian sat together on the porch, under a starry sky. "I never imagined I'd have this," Julian admitted, intertwining his fingers with hers. "A life with meaning beyond business." Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the peace of that moment. "And I never imagined I'd find someone who would teach me what it means to be truly loved." The night wind gently caressed their faces as they looked towards the future, knowing that although there would be challenges, they were no longer alone. Where are you listening to this story from? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. If you liked this ending, support us with a like and subscribe to the channel. It costs nothing. You don't need to fill out any forms. Just click the buttons and help this community continue to grow. Thanks for being here, and until the next story.